Hey everyone, back again. Today we're on to something new. Jasbir K. Puar's Terrorist Assemblages, which I believe I'm going to do in two parts because I haven't quite finished it yet. And to be totally honest, if you're listening to this on Saturday, when I normally upload things, just know that I've recorded this just a few hours before it's gone live. So yeah, I'm trying to get everything in order. Anyway, it's going to be two parts. This episode, I believe, is going to cover, well, it will cover the introduction in chapter 1, and then part 2 is going to cover the rest of the book. But before jumping into it, you should know, this subject matter, obviously, it's very intense. We're going to be discussing things that are going to deal with intergenerational trauma and American imperialism and sexual violence in no direct ways or no illustrative ways. We'll talk about these things quite generally, but also pointing the finger at the culprits here without describing the horrors in great detail. Before jumping into it, hi, I'm David. Should have introduced myself earlier. If you're new here, you can see videos I release every few weeks. If you subscribe to things, if you found this on YouTube, you're going to be able to find it as just a podcast on pretty much any podcast platform where there should be fewer ads. There shouldn't be any, but sometimes they sneak in. So we talk about that another day. Or if you found this as a podcast, you can find me on YouTube, or sometimes I also release video. So if you're into that, do all those things. You can follow me on other platforms. If you feel like contributing, instead contribute to one of the organizations below monetarily. That would help out a lot, especially to help Palestinians in need, because they need it. And I'll probably link some funds for various college students who are being deported because of these fascist draconian measures that have gone into effect. But yeah, in any case, let's jump into it with the introduction. Homonationalism and biopolitics. So what is she doing here? What is she doing in this book? Well, we get a pretty clear idea when we look at the subtitle, and that is Homonationalism in Queer Times. And I'm going to do an episode specifically as a keyword episode on homonationalism, so stay tuned for that. But here she's looking at and really trying to investigate one component, a very important one, of the operations and machinations of American empire, and that is the role of homonationalism and the broader project of the fantasy of liberation as a means to justify colonial violence, specifically Western colonial violence against, in this case, people in the Middle East, Muslim people, Arab people. But even in using these terms, we are submitting to an Orientalist frame that just homogenizes all these people into one clump. Now, in some ways, it's important to do that because that is exactly what American empire views these people as. So it's using their terms, but it's also very important to acknowledge that these terms have been designed and are continually used in ways to justify American hegemony. So here she's looking, this whole book is really looking at the ways in which the rhetoric of gay liberation and queer politics are used to justify American violence against people who are perceived to be not in the service of queer politics and gay liberation. This is kind of the big overall project of the book, and we're going to get into all the details as we go on here. So she begins her introduction. And she wrote this in the early 2000s. It came out in 2007, I believe. But she begins with a quote by Amy Kaplan, who called out the conservative columnist Charles Krauthammer, I think that's how you pronounce it, Krauthammer, who wrote that people are now coming out of the closet on the word empire. Now, Kaplan reads this and she's like, how dare you? How dare you, evil conservative media pundit? How dare you use the language reserved for gay liberation and for people coming out of the closet and the importance of that? How dare you use that language to refer to empire as though people can come out of the closet in using the word empire and feeling safe to use the word empire? Now, it might seem like, okay, Kaplan's onto something here. This is good. Obviously, people shouldn't be appropriating language that isn't part of their community, especially for genocidal ends. But what lurks underneath Kaplan's point is an idea that queer politics is somehow always in opposition to American hegemony and violence. where Puar just steps in and she's like, hey, are we really going to pretend as though the very rhetoric of queerness and gay liberation hasn't been used in the service of empire before? And this is exactly what she means by homonationalism. And she's going to look at many specific ways that the rhetoric of gay liberation is used to bolster the state, to bolster American empire. And she calls this homonationalism. So this book, broadly, it looks at the role of Western sexual exceptionalism, the regulatory operations of queerness, and white supremacy in the production of terrorist and citizen bodies. So she's looking at the ways in which, and hence from the title, terrorist assemblages, that is, what are all the kind of sticky elements and qualities that comprise this person recognized as the terrorist, and how are they offered? That is, how is the terrorist offered as an antithetical opposite to this idea of the citizen? And it's not a neat, clean-cut thing at all. In fact, as we go through here, it's going to grow more and more complicated, specifically the ambiguous relationship and view that Western empire has of people in the Middle East. As on the one hand, if you look at the kind of history of Orientalist framings of people in the Middle East, they're depicted as being quite often extremely traditional, prudish, bound up with their religion. But then you can find so many other examples of people in the Middle East being depicted as like polygamist, sexually depraved, almost like just being totally engulfed by uncontrollable sexual desire. And the point is, and really when you deal with the logics, if I can even call it that, the logics of imperialism, we often find that it isn't logical. It just picks its targets and will level any kind of accusations against them it can, even if they do not make sense. Even if they do not make sense in like the role of stereotypes to like make sense of a people. Like it doesn't even work in those ways because these are contradictory ideas. Now, Puar will problematize this to say like, well, they might seem to be contradictory, but she's going to show exactly how these things can operate at the same time. How on the one hand, in the post 9/11 America, there was like so much anti or homophobic vitriol that was being leveled against gay Americans. But on the other hand, America was celebrating itself as this like bastion for gay liberation and gay acceptance vis-a-vis or in comparison to the Middle East. Now, the same kind of contradiction is found in like what I just said in the depiction of people in the Middle East as being on the one hand hypersexual and on the other hand extremely traditional and reserved. But these kind of contradictory narratives all resolve themselves with this thing called homonationalism, which is exactly what we're going to get to. But let's first look at the way in which America deploys the logic of exceptionalism. And this is part of much of its history. It goes all the way back to Manifest Destiny, but specifically the role of sexual exceptionalism. So exceptionalism in all its forms has really been central to the United States for much of its history. So in the US, and it extends beyond the US to Western sexual exceptionalism overall, it works to paint the US and the West as sexually liberated and therefore justify in exerting force against non-liberated others in need of this kind of liberation, in need of this enlightenment. And we see this on full display with the Israeli genocide that continually paints Palestinians as being sexually limited or homophobic or anything like this, where you have Israelis committing unbelievable atrocities in Palestine, but it's okay because they wave pride flag. And then as we go on, I think some of the other strange things that Israelis get up to when they enter Palestinian homes, like wearing people's lingerie and stuff, we're going to see exactly why that makes sense. And also why this isn't just like Israel. This has been a very popular tactic across American hegemonic history as Israel being, another demonstration of that. And it's important not to see it as being like a singular event, even though that isn't to say there's nothing out of the ordinary about Israel's genocide. But it is part of this broader Western treatment of Arabs, of people in the Middle East, and it extends to so many others, people in the global South, and of course in Asia and so on. Of course, we see the same tactics play out over and over and over again. Now, one of the great ironies here is that gay marriage is illegal in Israel. And one of the great ironies here are the continued and repeated pieces of evidence of the ways in which Israelis systematically sexually assault Palestinian hostages. And they've been doing so for decades. And it's just, there's so many reports about this, so much evidence that just gets completely disregarded. But then Israel is able to brand itself as this state that is somehow for queer liberation, gay liberation. And they're very strategic in the way that they use women in various photo ops and stuff to offer themselves as this apparent, feminist alternative to the Muslim world that they believe themselves to be surrounded by and continually threatened by. So these are all elements of the same kind of strategic use of the logic of liberation, specifically sexual liberation, to justify these violences. Now, it's used to not only justify American violence, but it's to deflect from the homophobia and queerphobia that is still very much a part of American culture. So on the one hand, homonationalism is offered as this way to kind of rope in docile gay people or that are aligned with the state project of genocide or Western hegemony, and then use them and appropriate them to justify further violences, all the while not really advocating for the improvement of the lives of gay and other sexual minorities within the United States and in the Western world that still experience unbelievable amounts of harm, be it at institutional levels, be it from their family, be it from their communities and so on. These are real problems that need to be addressed. But these problems are only taken up in any kind of serious way in this context if it can serve the state in the end. So then the entire project of liberation in this way is offered to echo Gayatri Spivak. It's offered as a means of liberating, not just this, but liberating brown women from brown men, which is how Spivak frames this. And this is a common theme. The idea as well as, and this would inform a lot of the feminist rhetoric in the post 9/11 period and pre 9/11 period about the headscarf, about the veil, about the niqab, about any kind of dress that they do not think aligns with their feminist values. They can then use this to justify American presence and American violence in these areas if it is in the service of liberating these women. And there are so many cases of this. I mean, there's so many books that talk about this in so much important detail, be the work of Chandra Mohanty or Sarah Ahmed or so many others who have written about white feminists speaking on behalf of and offering solutions on behalf of to apparently improve the lives of Muslim women, often without actually listening to those women and their actual concerns and their understandings of patriarchal oppression. And Puar writes about this in the case of the example of the Revolutionary Association of the Women of Afghanistan that have been working for decades to oppose patriarchy within Afghanistan, be it from Taliban rule or any other government. And that was just totally erased by, for example, the Feminist Majority Foundation that just swooped in and was like, oh, we have all the solutions for feminist liberation. And then white women could paint themselves as being the saviors of Muslim women. Now, even in within this framework, Puar suggests that the Revolutionary Association of the Women of Afghanistan were also culpable insofar as they primarily reflected middle-class Afghanistan, women in Afghanistan, which was just which is another point from Spivak, is the way in which even narratives about people in certain parts of the world, anywhere in the world, tends to reflect those of the most privileged classes or castes or any part of that world. And so actually understanding and trying to ameliorate or mitigate the suffering of everybody often doesn't actually account for everyone. It often doesn't even account for the majority. Instead, mostly reflects a middle class or upper middle class perspective of people who are often seen and rendered intelligible by the people doing the looking and being like, oh, okay, we can correct what's going on here. But they only see the people that they can recognize. They don't actually recognize the people in the most squalid poverty and suffering that might need assistance the most. Of course, we're assuming that they're actually wanting this assistance in the first place. Now, it's really important, like for Puar, it's really important to clarify that Puar doesn't have an issue with gay people or any queer people for that matter. That's not what's at issue here. The issue is the appropriation of gay liberation in the service of empire, which I want to make very clear. Now, it's really important to stress this because without that, then it just obviously degrades into another version of homophobia. But it's important, too, to offer what I think are many people have really accurately and I think importantly pointed out the limits of queer politics of doing the thing it claims to do. And that is transgressing the boundaries of various norms. And oftentimes, queer politics tends to leave unexamined certain elements of its project that make it culpable or make it complicit in the operations of empire. So for example, and she talks about queer regulatory mechanisms that refer to the secular liberal monopolization of queer life as always already framing Muslims and or other like religious people as being intolerant to queer people or being queer phobic. And this is a really important element of what Puar is offering here. And we hear similar things coming out of like Jacques Halberstam and Sarah Ahmed in their concerns for the ways in which queer politics has been offered without actual substantive change and has instead been just a way for individual self-expression, which is important, obviously, for people to have opportunities to express themselves that make sense to them in the world that they occupy, in the bodies that they occupy. But if that's the limit, if that's where queer politics starts and ends, is it really queer? And this is something that Halberstam asks, and one of the criticisms that Halberstam puts out is that queer politics has been really marred by metronormativity. And that is the idea that queer people only really live in cities or urban settings. And this has come at the expense of the rich histories of queer people who are religious, living in religious settings, living in rural settings, as though they just don't exist at all, which is a problem within some elements of queer scholarship, at least in its most popular renditions. That is, it often locates queerness to certain spaces, which happen to be cosmopolitan, secular, liberal spaces, which is a complete erasure of all the different ways that queer politics can manifest in so many different spaces, including in the Middle East, and in so many different ways there. Like queer politics in Palestine looks different, yet might have some affinities with queer politics in Afghanistan or Iran, or even within each of those countries, the different ways in which queer politics might look from region to region. You know, there's going to be differences, and there's going to be different cultures in all of this, and it's impossible to just wrap it up into, you know, a neat package and be like, this is the history of all queer people in this context. Like, that never exists. Now, the way in which queer phobia is often leveled against and projected onto Muslim people happens in such a way as to conflate the religion of Islam with Arab-speaking people in general. And this has been a way by which to just offer this blanket queer-phobic condemnation, or to suggest that everyone in the Middle East is therefore queer-phobic. And it has been, it's an effective tool to justify harming, displacing, murdering entire populations. Like, this is a tool of empire. And it's a way by which to erase all of the complexity of these regions and these people and the many different cultures, not even like self-identified queer cultures within these regions that problematize the idea that there's a single identity of what it means to be Muslim or Arab or anything like that. Obviously, I mean, it goes without saying. And we can find examples of this too, the same kind of projection of queerphobia onto like uh, ultra-Orthodox Christians or ultra-Orthodox Jews in so many different religious settings. The difference is that they are not then, the same criticism is not extended to a bunch of kind of superficially associated people, like in the case of Arabs, with that same kind of projection or with that idea of being queerphobic. The same doesn't extend to Christians and being like, well, therefore all English speakers, just like what is assumed of all Arabs, is therefore they are all therefore queerphobic. Like, you don't see that go on in those ways. So it's about who gets to actually be clumped together and whose identity is then taken as a sign of a broader cultural problem. Whereas in the case of like the Christian right, those people who harbor those views can then be so neatly bracketed off, and it's like, oh, well, it's just a product of their views. They're just some outliers to what otherwise is a liberated project of Western emancipation and gay liberation. Now, I recognize that I've been using terms like gay and queer as though they're interchangeable, and obviously they are not. Obviously they are not at all. And I think that even with Puar here, and this was in 2007, I think some of the work around this would still be done over the next 15 years up till today. So I think that there are some kind of loose equivalencies going on here, but I think many of the criticisms remain the same. And, when she's referring to gay people, she's not targeting them specifically. She's talking about things like homonormativity, the effort to be gay in a way that kind of resonates with the overall hegemonic project of American imperialism or American, domestic policy, capitalist interest, all these types of things. Just adding gay people to an oppressive dynamic as though that'll just, end these legacies of homophobic oppression. Of course, this comes at the expense of all those people who might identify as gay, but who might also identify, for example, as non-monogamous, or who might identify as communists, or who might identify not even within the gender they were assigned at birth, yet still embrace these titles. Are they accepted in the same ways as like a gay couple that, buys a big house and adopts children in the right way, and they have their big house and white picket fence, and they tend their yard and all these types of things? They consume a lot. They go on many vacations every year. Like, we're talking about very different people, very different experiences within the same category potentially of gayness. And so if I was to offer any kind of a critique, and this is probably something that Puar would have by now thought of, is like, how do you then tend to these differences here and the differing ways in which these groups have various different affiliations, depending on the people too, with American hegemony and with the broader hegemonic status quo. Now, whereas people in the Middle East have often been framed as being, historically within the Orientalist imagination as being sexually depraved and uncontrollable, and today, or at least in the post 9/11 period, today when she was writing the book, post 9/11 period, Muslim people were depicted not so much in that way in general, but instead as being these Islamic fundamentalists that were extremely sexually prudish and closed off. And this was used as justification to say that they are therefore oppressive and repressive towards gay people. But that actually is only part of the story. And to complete the story, or to look at a little bit more of the picture, we have to factor in the other ways in which specific elements, specific people within that domain are characterized differently. And that is the way that terrorists are often imbued with all of those other qualities as being like sexually uncontrollable, maybe sexually frustrated, as being maybe still in the closet, which is something that she'll unpack here, at least this logic and how people were talking about terrorists in these ways, which we're going to get into in more detail. But the terrorist would then take on all of these kind of negative qualities that were once kind of overall associated with the Middle East. And these would then be used as ways to understand why people commit acts of terror. And all that this does is it works to ignore the other material reasons that people resort to resistive violence against occupation, against military occupation in any form, against dispossession, against stealing resources, and so on. And this is just another example of empire having its cake and eating it too, in its characterization of Muslims as being very closed off, repressed, and then terrorists as being these hypersexual, evil people who just want to capture women and children and do horrible things to them. This is how the propaganda effect works to normalize Israeli and Western aggression against these people. Now, all of this was kind of put on full display in 2006 when Israel hosted World Pride in Jerusalem, no less. Jerusalem, which is an occupied city, and it's even from the Israeli angle is a very conservative city compared to like Tel Aviv, of course. But what that was a way by which Israel could show the world, artificially, of course, show the world that it is this safe haven for gay people that would otherwise feel unsafe anywhere else. And this is such a common thing. I mean, as part of the Israeli propaganda machine is to have people continually say things like they never had a home until they went to Israel, or they'll find someone who happens to be Arab and, they'll scour the lands and find that one person who happens to be Arab who's willing to speak highly of Israel. And then they'll blast their voice being like, oh, this one person felt unsafe being gay in whatever country they came from, and they found a kind of home in Israel. And all of this works to justify, the continued occupation of Palestinians. And very conveniently, Israel doesn't come out and say that, oh yeah, by the way, but gay marriage is still illegal. It's funny, they can do that, but yeah. Now, when World Pride took off in 2006, I mean, this created quite a stir. And, people started to recognize the limits of queer politics if those queer politics are going to be complicit in genocide, apartheid, and occupation. Like, obviously, these should not be elements of pride or world pride. And so a number of many different slogans appeared, like no pride in genocide, or no pride without Palestine, which I don't think is one of their slogans, but in any case, it shows the limits of queer politics if those queer politics are just in the service of empire. Now, for decades, but especially after 9/11, the West, the quote-unquote West, offered gay marriage as the antidote to the looming threat of Islamic fundamentalism. So quoting someone named Roy, gay marriage for him is less about gay rights and more about codifying an ideal of European values, which is a very good point. And we're going to see later on how this idea of making gay marriage legal in the Middle East, like forcing it to be legal, would be a way by which to curb terrorism, because for some commentators, terrorists were just closeted gay people who just didn't have another outlet. But I think that Roy is really on point here, that Puar cites, to be like, gay marriage really isn't about gay rights, because gay rights, there's so many other things to factor in. It's so much about codifying an ideal of European values. This nuclear family, this monogamous nuclear family dynamic that relies upon continued consumption, maintaining that nuclear family in a home that you'll probably never own because the bank owns it, and making sure you do all the proper holidays and buying events and vacations and all that. You're working within the system at that point. And more abstractly, the project of queer politics, insofar as it has branded itself as being a project of transgression, transgressing norms and everything like this, takes on another comparative point, or resonates with American hegemony in another way, insofar as America has continually told itself that it is the country of transgression. It transgresses things. I mean, America is where people have the First Amendment. They're allowed to transgress. And this is taken as just a sign on its own of emancipation, of liberation, of possibility. But Puar suggests that this very claim of transgression, if it isn't actually carefully interrogated, it will only end up mirroring this logic of trademark freedom, this logic of trademark American exceptionalism, and so on. And Sarah Ahmed says similar things in like queer phenomenologies to, push back against the idea that queer politics are just these individual efforts of self-expression, like I said before. So citing Sarah Ahmed, the rhetoric of freedom and liberation consecrate just another binary between the free white queer subject and the oppressed other. This fabled other that exists in the constant shadow of their own oppression, whereas the white queer subject is open up to all the cosmopolitan possibilities of their city. In the popular imaginings and representations of this project, this isn't representative of all queer white people, obviously, but it's a thing. It was certainly a thing in the post 9/11 period, and there's lots of reasons for that, and we're going to get into them. And also, in all of this, we haven't really talked a whole lot about white supremacy, but the ascendancy of whiteness and white supremacy, it reached a fever pitch in this period with like the colorblind emphasis on work and wealth. It's like if you work hard and you've accrued money, race doesn't matter. You're welcome in any neighborhood if you just earn the right to. But narratives such as those just ignore the histories of dispossession that have made things like neighborhoods even possible, where neighborhoods have been largely the product of underpaid labor that has come from people who were not white in the US in so many cases. And this is what makes possible, the very roots of segregation, which intergenerationally have disallowed non-white people from proportionally accessing like generational wealth or intergenerational wealth through home ownership, because there have been just systematic laws and maneuvers in place to limit Black people's opportunities to acquire land and homes, or if they did own land and homes, they had them taken away or they were cast out or anything like that. And so the whole move towards colorblindness, which was popular certainly at this time in the post 9/11 period, even a little bit before, all of this helped to normalize whiteness and to take whiteness and white people from being culpable in these histories of dispossession and racism and violence, and to then just make it about merit. If we just worked hard enough, that's why we're here, we worked hard enough. But really at the end of the day, the best marker, determinant for someone being rich is whether their parents were rich. If you have rich parents, you're probably going to be fine. However, if you don't, you're probably going to need to work like a lot just to survive. And this is one of the great tricks of Western capitalism as it manifests today, is the way in which it places emphases purely on individuals as being responsible for their own destinies. And if they are unable to, it's their own fault. You can't point to history. You can't point to legacies of enslavement. You can't point to Jim Crow laws or anything like this, because that's just in the past, which is a very effective trick of capitalist exploitation and white supremacy. And then things like multiculturalism emerge to essentially erase these connections between capitalism and white supremacy and to subject people to the litmus test of like good old American values, where it's like, yeah, we will allow within the United States, we're going to allow as many different people that want to come here as possible, but only if they demonstrate the proper allegiance, which they have to do, the Pledge of Allegiance, to these American values. And only then will they be allowed to properly assimilate into this country, which is just, an unbelievably problematic thing to do. But it's one that just assumes the naturalness of whiteness and its attendant values and qualities that have been baked into the American way of life. Now, all of this works to associate queerness with whiteness and to identify the roots of that association between queer politics and whiteness, as though non-white people have never been queer before. It's the same with like feminism and how the history of feminism is often relegated to and monopolized by the struggles of white women, when women all across the globe for potentially thousands of years have been engaging in this thing called feminism insofar as they're opposing patriarchal power. Now, not everywhere and not everybody, but it seems extremely myopic and narrow-sighted to just locate the origins of feminism with white feminists in the US with the Seneca Falls Convention, to suggest that it's at that moment that, women started to fight back or something. Like, what? Like, what a way to center the American white perspective in this movement. And this offers the idea that white people are always prepared and they have this rich history of transgressing these strict traditions because they have an ownership over these movements, over these efforts to oppose these arbitrary kind of enforcements of power. And you get examples like this. Take Zizek, for example. Zizek, who writes about enslavement, where he just says flat out, like almost verbatim, he's like, the biggest opponents to enslavement were the communists. And I'm like, are you kidding me? Like, you think the biggest opponents to enslavement were the communists? The biggest opponents to enslavement were enslaved people. And even in the way that he phrases that, what is he doing is erasing those people and saying that even their possibility of liberation has to go through the filter of yet another European paradigm, that is communism. For all its merits, obviously, but in doing that, in applying that narrative there, it just normalizes whiteness as the race of transgression, as the race that opposes power, which is not true at all, of course. And she offers a really great quote here where she says that the homosexual other is white, whereas the racial other is straight, implying that the racialized other is always still caught within their tradition and hasn't yet been opened up to the spectral light of queer liberation. Now, Puar ends the introduction, by problematizing Butler's critique of Foucault, specifically Foucault's idea of biopolitics. So let me just put this really quickly. But Foucault's idea of biopolitics from the history of sexuality suggests that power is no longer exercised with an emphasis upon death. So historically, Foucault identifies how power used to use death as a way to vitalize power. So he talks about what he calls the spectacle of the scaffold. So people would be put to death in a town square if they committed a crime or something. And this was a way by which the sovereign, the person in power, was able to show the other people, like, hey, this is what will happen to you if you mess with me. And it was a way by which to continually vitalize and remind people of the sovereign's power. Now, that's not really the case today. I mean, you can find examples of it still very much being the case today. But overall, Foucault suggests that power is transformed to be exercised not by emphasizing death, but instead by emphasizing life. And so power became interested in managing populations, in controlling abilities to reproduce. The whole abortion, quote unquote, debate centers on the idea that it is good to create life, at least from anti-choice people. It is good to give life. And this is actually just another form of power because it places people who can give birth under this kind of control that is, in a lot of ways, quite tricky to oppose because those people who are anti-choice believe that they are fighting on behalf of life, which is another example of biopower. This is the use of power in the service of life, extending life, making life more efficient, making it more productive, which works very well for global politics and for population politics that organizes people according to populations, be it on the basis of race. So in the case of like the Middle East, where as soon as you start to put these qualities of people together according to national boundaries and national understandings of race and everything like that, you're suddenly able to recognize them as a homogeneous whole with as one entire body comprised of all these people that can then be treated and diagnosed like a body. So the Muslim other in this context as a single body that comprises all Muslim people is then diagnosed as being in the service of death in their opposition to things like to queer liberation and gay people and so on and so forth. Like all of these examples are used in ways to denigrate Muslim people on the basis of this biopolitical recognition of this homogeneity on their part. Now, Butler responds to this to say that Foucault, my guy, Foucault, are you kidding? Are you really trying to say as though death is no longer really a factor here? And Butler offers the point very correctly. Like, if we look at the HIV epidemic in the US, which killed Foucault, Butler says, like, look, we're seeing the way that death is just instrumentalized every day to erase certain people from the social body, let alone when it's used in the service of empire and everything like this. And the thing with this is I think Butler's totally right. I think that, without getting into the nitty gritty here, Foucault did account for all of that in more or less terms, where he's very clear that in the age of biopolitics, we find the most violent horrors that could ever exist in terms of death and violence, where biopolitics for him, it has never just been about like saying yes to life and saying no to death. It's instead about saying yes to life and saying hell yes to death if it means extracting entire populations from the social body, from the global order. So whereas under sovereign power, it was just about putting like one person to death to make a show for everyone else, now it's about looking at populations like bodies that are then susceptible to things like viruses. And as soon as an entire population can be branded as a virus, they can be exterminated, which is one of the tools of biopolitics that Foucault just says flat out. I mean, he totally acknowledges this, and he uses the example of the Holocaust. Like, it was an example of a biopolitical form of power that tried to actually do away with violence in its Nazi variation. I mean, the violence is inflicted against Jews in like Romania and Hungary, kind of outside of the purview of Nazism, even though the Nazis were committing like actual violence, direct violence against Jews too, and Roma people and disabled people and so on. The violences of the pogroms in Romania and Hungary can't be understated. They are very much relics of perhaps other kinds of violence and power, not just biopower, not necropower, not whatever. But yeah, all of this falls under this umbrella here. Now, Puar steps in to say, like, okay, Butler, I see your point. Death is still a factor here. But are we really going to pretend as though it's just like all queer people are a victim to this? Are we really going to pretend as though like queer people are not in the service of this sometimes? And are we really going to pretend as though the very logic of queer liberation that centers white subjectivities and white ideas about liberation are not in themselves in the service of American empire? Like, without examining these things, Butler just offers queer politics as this like fairy tale antidote to violence and to biopower or any other kind of power. And that puts us here into chapter 1, the sexuality of terrorism. Now, up until 2007, not a whole lot of attention had been given to the sexualized ways that the US framed its war on terror. The terrorist was not only painted as an ideological fundamentalist, but also a perverse sexual being teetering between uncontrollable homoeroticism and sexist ideations of brutalizing white American women and Israeli women. Common theme among Israeli state propaganda is the idea that Muslim men are always, it's the new kind of blood libel directed against Muslims. And I hope that one day we're able to describe it in the same way we describe blood libel that was used against Jews historically. But the way in which Israeli state propaganda depicts Muslim men as being these evil, sexually just uncontrollable beings trying to capture Israeli women. And why do they do this? Well, they do it for lots of reasons. It justifies continued occupation. But one of the other reasons is that by branding the terrorist in this way, by attributing these qualities to the terrorist in these ways, they're able to offer the alternative or opposite qualities as being indicative of the citizen, who is often offered as this kind of contrapoint to the terrorist. Where if we think about this in binary terms, what is opposed to the citizen? Well, it's the terrorist. Citizen doesn't oppose citizen. In the global order we live in, terrorism takes on a new kind of threat that historically didn't really exist. It is only the product really of globalization. that you have non-state actors working in such a way as to oppose the hegemony of states, which, of course, we haven't had states forever. I know it's a bigger conversation. Don't hold me to like thinking this is the end of the story. But just to be quite simple about it, the way that the terrorist is framed is used to offer the citizen as being its opposite, which is the very logic of binary thinking. And this is what Derrida's project of deconstruction does. Where if we were to apply Derrida here, Derrida would be like, well, we see in this case how the creation of the binary doesn't actually tell us anything about these groups, because it's not, nothing can really be reduced to binaries in such neat ways. But instead it tells us everything about how the privileged group is just using this fabricated other, in this case the terrorist, to then like project all of the negative qualities that the dominant group doesn't want to really associate with itself yet are very much a part of it, but can then say, oh, it's not us, it's over there. Those people embody those traits. Now, in these ways, terrorism is kind of queer, which is kind of a strange thing to say, but in the way that they're framed as being sexually uncontrollable, in some cases, being totally overcome by homoerotic desire, being totally being non-monogamous, or polygamous is the word that Puar uses, being all of these things indicates a queer subject to some extent, insofar as the other side of this coin suggests that in that space is this hyper-rigid, Islamic fundamentalism. So just kind of by, for following the logic here, these are queer subjects. However, Puar identifies that they are not the right kind of queer subjects. They are instead the bad queer subjects. They who live without the other important Western normative values. So they embrace many qualities of queerness, but because they don't properly resonate with the other American or Western values, they're then not celebrated as the right kind of queer. And this reveals the way that queerness and recognizing queerness is quite exclusive. And that's because it reveals that queerness as a category doesn't really exist, and instead depends upon not one's sexual disposition, their gender identity, or anything like that. It instead depends upon someone's proximity to the subterfuge, to the kind of underbelly, to the structure of white capitalist Christian patriarchy, where queerness is measured not totally in relation to opposing norms, but in relation to opposing certain norms, while also embracing some of the qualities found within those norms, in this case, Western values and Western ideals. Now, to conduct this overall analysis, she chooses not to really engage with conservative voices because obviously they're going to spout stuff that's Islamophobic, that is going to parrot American hegemonic talking points, and so on. And so she chooses to look at people who identified as more liberal to show and demonstrate that they are very much culpable in what we know the conservatives to be culpable in. Of course, they're going to be in the service of homophobia, of Islamophobia, of American patriotism, and so on. So here she's going to look at feminist and queer characterizations of this figure of the terrorist. She's also going to look at the gay and lesbian tourism industry in the post 9/11 period, and also she's going to look at South Park, which I'll talk about briefly. I always struggle with talking about other entertainment or other books on here, because if you aren't familiar with it, it's going to be totally, you're not going to know. So I'll talk about it a little bit. But these are the three things she's going to focus on that are ostensibly these sites of liberal politics that just end up being extensions of American hegemony. So she starts by looking at Ellen DeGeneres, specifically Ellen DeGeneres' speech during the 2001 Emmy Awards, where she asked, "What would upset the Taliban more than a gay woman wearing a suit in front of a room full of Jews?" Which is what she said at the 2001 Emmy Awards. And so what she's essentially suggesting here, to be a rich gay woman wearing a suit, standing in front of some of the wealthiest people in America, some of them, is somehow a mode of resistance, where you have Ellen DeGeneres living her most privileged life, extremely wealthy, standing in one of the most celebrated venues and award ceremonies on earth, saying that she is partaking in an act of resistance against who? The Taliban. And this is exactly what Puar is talking about in terms of homonationalism, where Ellen DeGeneres' identity at all levels, her what she's wearing, her gender identity, her sexual orientation, are all offered as modes of resistance to this evil thing called the Taliban. And this image should set the stage for what will follow. Now, after 2001, when there was an entire military campaign deployed to fight the quote-unquote war on terror, it was really just, an invasion masquerading itself as some kind of humanitarian intervention in part of the world. But of course, all of it was proven to be totally false. I mean, the war of terror made no sense, given that the terrorists weren't actually from Afghanistan or Iraq, really, where the U.S. was invading. There were no weapons of mass destruction, yada, yada, yada. I mean, we all know this. I hope we all know this. Just Google it. I mean, it takes 5 seconds and you'll see the actual history of American hegemony in Iraq. And while you're there, look at the same history in the 90s and earlier, and continued U.S. aggression in Iraq, in Afghanistan, the types of aggression that birth resistance groups like the Taliban. So after 9/11, with all of this military stuff going on, these military operations, these offensive operations going on, there were so many images going around American television and on the internet, even though the internet was, it was kind of the early internet. It was a strange place in the post-2000 9/11 period. And what we saw were these repeated images of broken military homes, because one of the parents or both parents had to go and fight in this war, and therefore the home was crumbling, and therefore America was kind of crumbling. And America was not only then victimized on 9/11, it was victimized in the aftermath of the necessary response to 9/11. And it was kind of branded as both this horrible tragedy brought to America by the Taliban, by Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda, but it was then also offered where the continuation of the tragedy was offered as the antidote to that very initial moment of aggression. And this helped to vitalize this kind of Christian right movement. And it was a big thing in the early 2000s. I mean, it was under George Bush, and the whole evangelical Christian right thing was really going in full force. And this period also saw renewed criticisms of and condemnations from the Christian right towards non-normative forms of sexual and romantic couplings, where there was this veritable rise in racism, certainly directed against Arab people, but that had been going on for decades before, of course, but it had intensified violence against gay people and against other people of color. It was horrendous. Now, despite this, a new alliance between some gays and lesbians and American nationalism flourished. But how could that be? How did that happen? Some did so because they felt personally attacked on or after 9/11, and others did so because they believed that Muslims hate them more than their Christian counterparts. And so they're like, well, in America, I might be discriminated against, I might not have rights, but at least I'm not over there, where they've been told it is worse. So groups like the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force and the Human Rights Campaign were more worried about the rights of gay and lesbian people to serve in the military than they were about that very military murdering gay and lesbian people in Iraq and Afghanistan and in so many other places. Some went so far as to put the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan on par, or to suggest that homophobia was this evil thing on par with the invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan, which is an absurd thing to compare. The death toll in Iraq, hundreds of thousands of people, upwards of 1 million, if you factor in all the aggression about 15 years before 9/11 all the way to today. It's horrendous. So horrendous. And so in this moment, the inability of gay people to serve in the military is seen as more of an oppressive moment than that very military infiltrating and occupying sovereign nations. And it's just, it's not even considered. It's just taken as, oh, this must be done. It's part of the American destiny, pretty much. And this is just one example of what Puar will move into now in making a broader point about the confluence and resonance between gay politics and nation building, which might seem totally off base, but let me explain. Where within the idea of the US, historically, it is a nation that has prioritized and privileged heterosexual couplings, be it romantic or intimate, sexual, whatever, all these couplings. And even in narratives of fear, they're often framed in like fear of what other men in other contexts might do to women in this context. And so in even those fears, we see this heterosexual paradigm still playing out, more or less. However, Puar thinks that there's a little bit more going on here, even though obviously that's a big part of it. There's a little more going on. So instead of viewing homosexuality as always already oppressed, Puar encourages us to see it in it, the appropriation by the nation, but also some of the ways in which it has this kind of natural affiliation with the process of nation building. Where she writes, we see that the fraternal nation state is organized to promote political homosocial relations among men in order to discourage and prohibit homosexual relations between men. And so the entirety of the state, when you actually look at it, it's like it is incredibly homoerotic in the way in which it separates the gender. It only recognizes two genders and separates those genders in very strict ways and places men in certain institutional zones together and women in certain institutional zones together. And so there's a kind of like homoerotic fantasy always playing out in these spaces where, and this is the lesson of like Adrienne Rich and others, is to be like, it almost seems absurd then that there's this emphasis upon heterosexuality when every other institution in this world in like America is structured in a very homosexual way. That is just maintaining it as being unisexual. Like certain professions are like just meant for women. Certain professions are mostly meant for men, and so on. And we see that this play out in so many different ways. And this serves as the kind of bedrock for the nation itself, not marriage, which is just one institution of many, or romantic couplings or whatever. And so she's like, we have to factor this in the way in which this kind of homoeroticism and homoconnectivity is normalized and actually serves as the basis of the fraternal order that allows the United States that is like its modus operandi, like essentially how it operates is through this fraternal order. So while queerness might be policed overall, because indeed it is, and like the thing is, there's no world where I want you to come away from this thinking that either I or Puar are suggesting that somehow gay people are this privileged group within the United States' imagination or in the West in general. Like, obviously not. But there is more to the story than just suggesting like it's so cut and dry, neat, binary thinking like that. So queerness obviously is policed overall. But in her words, there's room for the absorption and management of homosexuality when advantageous for the nation. So she then considers the study of terrorism that almost always focuses on Muslim terror, or what can be ascribed to Muslims at least. So right-wing violence is barely registered as being terrorism. It's just branded as one single individual or group of individuals that happen to be, did something bad once. They're just some bad apples and so on. Whereas in the case of violence that can be attributed to Muslims, then that is used as evidence of the latent evil of all Muslims. So some scholars, like I mentioned before, go so far as to attribute Muslim fraternity as one cause behind terrorism. Now, of course, they conveniently ignore like Western fraternalism and fraternity, But the idea here and the insinuation is that if homosexuality were legal in these places, then terrorism would end because these men would be given a socially acceptable outlet to divert their anger and aggression. Or there's another reason or another explanation from Ahmed Rashid, who writes that most of these men grew up in refugee camps without the love of camaraderie of mother or sisters, which is just to impose another heterosexual paradigm onto this. And in both of these narratives, that Muslim men just need to access gay marriage and suddenly everything will be better, it obviously leaves unexamined the problematic elements of marriage itself. But just putting that aside, what a way to ignore the entire history of US and Western aggression against these people as reason for them to commit these violent acts. And this is what like Osama bin Laden says right away in his letter to the American people, where he's like, don't y'all want to know why we did this? All your explanations, they aren't cutting it. This was about Palestine, as a reason for 9/11, including the other examples like Chechnya and other examples of Western violence against, if Russia counts as the West, but of imperial violence against the Muslim world. And he's just like, this is why. Not any of these reasons as though they didn't have enough attention with women or anything like that, or they're latent homosexuals or anything like that. That's not what's going on here. It is a response to American imperialism. So to just return to homonationalism, we can't ignore the way that the market has made of queer identity a marketable group. In her words, as national identity is being reoriented towards excellence in consumption rather than public civic political participation, gay tourists are representative of a form of US exceptionalism. And this brings us to a broader conversation about the role of gay tourism after 9/11, where after 9/11, there was a veritable decline in tourism because people were scared flying on planes and traveling and stuff. But that didn't happen with gay and lesbian tourism. It actually remained stagnant. I think it went up a little bit because it was like their way of liberating themselves continually in the same ways that they had done before from so many different things, for good reason too. Where tourism can be an example of patriotic exceptionalism and even resistance following 9/11, as some elements of the gay and lesbian tourism industry capitalized on the ideological potential of travel as a demonstration of trademark freedom, which very much fit into this broader landscape of consumption. There's also the case of like after 9/11, George Bush getting up and doing one of his addresses to the people and being like, remember to keep buying things. Don't stop buying things, because that's what this country is built on. Like, what a great country. You must buy things for it to succeed. But this is just one of many ways that gay people may have obviously inadvertently participated within the broader imagination of American hegemony and American colonial power. And this should extend to questions about tourism in general, like different approaches to tourism and linguistic superiority and everything like this. Like, these are bigger questions to have, of course. And then she considers some episodes of South Park, which, they're just extremely Islamophobic, homophobic, and just really messed up, especially in this context. But it talks about so many different things. Like, apparently the show's about jokes. I never really watched South Park at all, so I'm not the great authority on South Park. But there's so many different examples of like Osama bin Laden being depicted as having like a small penis, and this being used as like justification for why he did what he did. Of course, this is just another way to erase American culpability. And she talks about another episode where they become like all trendy and metronormative, as Puar puts it, where they're trendy and they're like embracing queer culture. And except for one of the characters, I think it's Kyle, but whatever. One of the characters is wearing like, I don't know, like what they perceive to be regular clothes, like flannel, I don't know, whatever. So jeans and a t-shirt, whatever. And they say to him, they're like, oh, well, that's so September 10th, like pre 9/11. Whereas though like post 9/11 is a period of American liberation in the face of like evil Muslim fundamentalism. And yeah, that'll wrap up chapter 1. Next time we'll pick up with chapter 2, talking about Abu Ghraib and U.S. sexual exceptionalism, which is definitely difficult stuff to talk about. And yeah, we'll finish up the book with that one. I hope that you like what I did. If you did, you can like, share, subscribe, tell your friends. I don't know, share it with them. They might like it. Maybe they won't, but you could try. Yeah, if there's anything I got wrong, anything I excluded, I'd love to hear about it. You can leave a comment. I can pin it. We can all learn from your vast knowledge. It'll be brilliant. But yeah, on that note, hope you're all well. Catch you next time. Take care.